My friends, in the modern day and age, there has never been an actual proper water war. That being a war that is fought between nation states for control of a drinkable, usable water resource. But that may in fact be changing due to the actions now of the Taliban in Afghanistan. Actions that, without exaggeration, may have the potential to destabilize the entire region and send it plunging into war with its neighbors. Whether it is with Iran, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, or Kazakhstan, any of these nations may be willing to pull the trigger in order to protect what they see as their very lifeblood itself, their water. Should war break out, we are talking about a region in which 500 million people, in one of the most politically unstable but oil-rich regions in the world, could be placed in jeopardy. The potential humanitarian crisis that this would create would be catastrophic. But, my friends, when we talk about this, it's going to bring up several very important questions. First off, what exactly is happening? How is it that we got here? And what is going to happen next? Well, on that note, my friends, let's go ahead and dive into it. From the very beginning, when we go and talk about this video is set to be multifaceted, as we're exploring not just one singular dispute, but rather many of them, all of which center on one single nation, Afghanistan. Also, for the purpose of this video, we will be addressing water as the specific issue, which is different from the other issues that plague the region. Drug, ideological, religious, all of these things are certainly factors that lead to more problems, but those would be entirely separate videos on their own. As a result, before addressing the disputes, one needs to understand the state that Afghanistan is actually in and why this is something that threatens their neighbors. On that note, first off, when I say the word Afghanistan, what it is that I really mean here is the Taliban that actually controls the state of Afghanistan. The Taliban, as it is a Sunni Islamic fundamentalist and predominantly Pashtun movement. It is something that controlled most of Afghanistan from the period of 1996 to 2001. Then, in October of 2001, US and allied forces would invade the country and would quickly oust the Taliban regime following its refusal to hand over the terrorist leader, Osama bin Laden, in the wake of Al-Qaeda's 9/11 attacks. Following the US-led invasion, Taliban leadership would relocate to southern Afghanistan, and from there would go across the border to Pakistan. From there, they would wage an insurgency against the Western-backed government in Kabul, along with Afghan national security forces and international coalition troops that were there to try and put them down. For those who are watching, I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with the war in Afghanistan, the thing that went on for literally decades. When the US-led coalition would formally end its combat mission in 2014, the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, or ANDSF, this was put in charge of Afghanistan security. However, the issue is that the forces faced very significant challenges in actually holding territory and defending population centers. The Taliban would continue to attack rural districts and would carry out suicide attacks in major cities, with the ANDSF suffering very heavy casualties. The war would largely remain as a kind of stalemate for nearly 6 years, despite a small US troop increase in 2017, continuing combat missions, and a shift in US military strategy to target Taliban revenue sources, which involved airstrikes against drug labs and opium production sites. Yes, you heard me right. I can already see the confusion on a number of your faces. It would easily be another video on its own, like in a separate one entirely, but the Taliban, despite being fundamentally Islamists, are ironically some of the biggest drug dealers in the world. Something that is not allowed in Islam, but I digress. If you want to see a video on that, definitely let me know in the comment section below. In February of 2020, after more than a year of direct negotiations, the US government and the Taliban would sign a peace deal, the so-called Doha Agreement. This is something that would set a timeline for the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan. Under the agreement, the United States pledged to draw down US troops to approximately 8,500 personnel within 135 days and complete a full withdrawal within 14 months. In return, the Taliban pledged to prevent territory under its control from being used by terrorist groups and to enter negotiations with the Afghan government. However, that being said, no official ceasefire was ever actually put into place, and after a brief reduction in violence, the Taliban would quickly resume attacks on Afghan security forces and civilians. It didn't really work. Direct talks between the Afghan government and the Taliban would begin months after the agreed-upon start date of March of 2020, and ultimately negotiations would face multiple delays and make very little progress. Violence across Afghanistan would continue from 2020 through 2021, as the United States would increase airstrikes and raids targeting the Taliban. The Taliban, in turn, would attack Afghan government and ANDSF targets and would make significant territorial gains. Now, we are not going to go entirely into all the details of the US failure in Afghanistan, but it's important that we address this here because it is what sets the stage for everything else that we are talking about. In April of 2021, US President Joe Biden would announce that US military forces were going to leave Afghanistan by September of 2021. The Taliban, which had continued to capture and contest territory across the country despite ongoing peace talks with the Afghan government, would in turn ramp up attacks on ANDSF bases and outposts and began to rapidly seize more and more territory. In May of 2021, the US military would accelerate the pace of its troop withdrawal. By the end of July of 2021, the United States had completed nearly 95% of its withdrawal, leaving just 650 troops to protect the US embassy in Kabul. So it was then, in the summer of 2021, the Taliban would continue its offensive, threatening government-controlled urban areas and seizing several border crossings. In early August, the Taliban would begin direct assaults on multiple urban areas, including Kandahar in the south and Herat in the west. On August 6th, 2021, the Taliban would capture the capital of the southern Nimruz province, the first provincial capital to fall. After that, the provincial capitals would begin to fall in rapid succession. Within only a few days, the Taliban would capture more than 10 other capitals, including Mazar-e-Sharif in the north and Jalalabad in the east. This would leave Kabul as the only major urban area that was still under government control. On August 15th, 2021, over 2 weeks before the official U.S. withdrawal deadline, Taliban fighters would enter the capital. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani would subsequently flee the country, and the Afghan government would completely collapse. Later that day, the Taliban would announce they had entered the presidential palace, taking control of Kabul, and were establishing checkpoints to maintain security. The sheer speed of the Taliban's territorial gains and the collapse of both the ANDSF and Afghan governments completely surprised US officials and allies, as well as, reportedly, the Taliban itself. They did not expect to make as many gains as they did so rapidly. Following the Taliban takeover on August 15, 2021, the Biden administration would authorize the deployment of an additional 5,000 troops to assist in the evacuation of US and allied personnel, as well as thousands of Afghans who worked with the United States and were attempting to flee. This entire thing was a massive embarrassment for the United States and would stain the reputation of President Joe Biden for years to come. Following the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, more than 120,000 Afghans were airlifted and relocated around the world, with more than 76,000 arriving in the United States as of August of 2022. This is extremely important to note, and the reason we have to talk about this because the sheer amount of people who left the country at this time that were highly educated, government bureaucrats, intellectuals, individuals who had worked largely with the US government and also with the reigning Afghan regime, these were the people with the most technological, linguistic, and general knowledge in the entire country. And so when this takeover happened for a fundamentalist Islamist state, the amount of brain drain that would occur in this very short time period is something that would come to bite Afghanistan and now, as a result, the surrounding territories later. But we're going to be getting into that a bit later. Those remaining in the country under Taliban rule would steadily watch the regression and revision of any gains in liberal and democratic rights and freedoms over the last 20 years. Girls would once again be barred from secondary schools. Women would be required to have a male relative companion when traveling. Music would be banned. And flogging, amputations, and mass executions would be reintroduced. According to one New York Times investigation, the Taliban would kill or forcibly disappear nearly 500 former government officials and members of the Afghan security forces in just its first 6 months after taking over power. Afghans would also remain at a heightened risk of terrorist attacks, such as in August of 2022, when there was a bombing of a mosque, and in September of 2022, with the bombing of the Russian embassy, both in Kabul, and allegedly perpetrated by the Islamic State. The standard of living for a nation in this situation, as you can reasonably expect, would crash. Afghans would suffer from cascading and compounding humanitarian crises and would face the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, according to the United Nations, at that time. In January of 2022, the United Nations would launch the largest single country aid appeal in history to try and finance humanitarian assistance for Afghanistan. By March of 2022, 95% of Afghan households did not have enough to eat, with more than 3.5 million children being in need of nutrition treatment support. By August of 2022, more than 6 million people were on the brink of famine. And this is something that has only persisted to the current day, With increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters and extreme weather that has been seen in the region over the years, this is something that has elevated the population's exposure to food shortages, with searing heat waves and flash flooding destroying crops and arable land. Afghans have also seen food prices soar as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, which in turn further reduces the amount of things that can be imported into the country. Yes, my friends, for those who are wondering why it is that we are going into so much detail about this, why we are not talking more about the water war that I specifically mentioned in the beginning of this, what the whole purpose of this video is, you need to understand the context of why things are so bad in Afghanistan and why they are trying to do things in order to be able to fix their farmland. All of this is related. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan has been exacerbated by an economy that is on the verge of collapse constantly and suffering from severe international isolation. Sanctions and the termination of significant development aid would cripple the Afghan economy. The revocation of the country's central bank credentials would halt all basic banking transactions and would dramatically restrict critical cash flow that was relied upon by Afghan families for just daily market activities. Furthermore, during this time, inflation would skyrocket. There would be an over 50% increase in the price of basic goods from July of 2021 to June of 2022. Normally, in the event of such economic, political, humanitarian disasters, you would have a situation in which outside aid is able to come in and support the population. However, obtaining external assistance is very difficult, considering that we are talking about the Taliban government. Not only is the government less willing to receive aid from outsiders, as this is something that can weaken their rule, but simultaneously, Western governments are not very inclined to support them and help provide aid because doing so could be seen as bolstering the regime's legitimacy. Despite the humanitarian exceptions that have been issued by the United Nations, the United States, and other countries that have imposed sanctions on Afghanistan since the Taliban usurped power, the country remains largely starved of any kind of assistance. Additionally, at the time that we're talking about this, only a single nation to date formally recognizes the Taliban as an official government, that being China. That whole situation with China is going to sound weird, and it's going to make some people wonder, well, what about all the other Muslim states that surround Afghanistan? Would they not recognize this Islamic takeover? And while technically speaking, they don't, at least not in the official sense, de facto, many of these states do, because some deals and negotiations have still been done with the Taliban, and any kind of deal is something that recognizes the legitimacy and authority, even if this is not officially done through, say, the UN or anything else. For the rest of the countries around the world, though, they do not recognize them. In response to a June 2023 Taliban request for UN recognition, the UN envoy to Afghanistan would say that it was, quote, nearly impossible as long as the Taliban maintains its restrictive laws on women and girls. No one wants to work with them. And for that matter, the Taliban doesn't really want to work with the rest of the world. For clarification of what it is that I mean when talking about these restrictive laws, in November of 2022, the Taliban would announce a state of new extreme laws, including banning women from parks and gyms and reintroducing public flogging and executions. In December of 2022, the Taliban would further roll back women's educational rights when they would bar them from university grounds and tutoring centers after having allowed them to take entrance exams earlier that year. So yes, women were allowed to take the test to get into universities, and then once they passed, were then told, ha, no, get back in the home. In addition to drawing harsh international criticism, the Taliban's strict laws would prompt even Qatar and China, some of its closest partners, to lobby for the easing restrictions in May of 2023. However, international condemnation failed to change the Taliban's behavior. It simply does not care. The Taliban maintains its position on women and girls, which the UN characterized as a gender apartheid. To this day, it continues to conduct hundreds of public floggings, and it would even carry out its second public execution in June of 2023. In addition to these gender issues, domestically speaking, the Taliban has made it all the more difficult for aid agencies to operate in Afghanistan by continuously harassing aid workers and banning women from working for the UN. Along with the loss of donors due to anger over the Taliban's policies, these conditions have forced the UN to reduce its funding request for Afghanistan by $1 billion. The World Food Program would say that the overall drop in funding would deprive an additional 9 million Afghans of food aid. Combined with this, policies of the Taliban would also contribute to affecting the livelihoods of everyday people, which on that note, it's going to get weird because we are briefly going to mention the thing that I talked about with drugs. The Taliban has, ironically, after years of using opium production to fund their efforts, have now cracked down upon opium production, cutting it by about 80%. Which has deprived Afghan communities of revenue that over the years they largely needed to purchase food. Again, this is one of the really weird things, with the Taliban simultaneously being one of the largest drug traffickers and also cracking down on it per Islamic law. But that needs to be an entirely other separate video. But meanwhile, that brings us back to the purpose, the entire point of why we were creating this video in the first place. Water shortages have led to conflicts with a number of nations and potentially will be getting worse, including with Iran when there had been gunfire at the border over access to water in the Helmand River, and also with its northern neighbor of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. That is the meat of things with this issue. The water dispute, with the first one that we're going to be addressing in here being the one with Iran, which is older. Now, my friends, when we talk about this, water disputes between Iran and Afghanistan date quite far back, as early as the 1870s. However, with the Taliban that has come back into power in Kabul since 2021, this is something that has only gotten exceptionally worse. The Helmand River has increasingly become a topic of contention between the neighboring countries, particularly this last year in 2023. You see, in May of 2023, clashes would erupt between Iran and Afghanistan after President Ibrahim Raisi would charge that the Taliban government was restricting access to water from the Helmand River. The 621-mile-long river flows across Afghanistan, and it empties into lakes and wetlands in southeastern Iran that is used by hundreds of thousands of people. More than 90% of Iran's 85 million people would face drought conditions over the course of 2022 and 2023. As the president of Iran would say at the time on May 18th of 2023, quote, "I warn the rulers of Afghanistan to immediately give the people of Sistan Baluchistan their water rights. We will not allow the rights of our people to be violated." This is something that the president of Iran would say at the time while visiting the drought-stricken area. It's at this point that a fight would break out, and at least 3 border guards, 2 Iranians and 1 Taliban fighter, would end up being killed during the fighting. The tensions would coincide with a diplomatic standoff. On the 25th of May, the foreign minister of Iran would say that the Islamic Republic of Iran still did not recognize Taliban rule in the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, saying, and I quote, "We will not recognize the current rulers of Afghanistan and insist on the need to establish an inclusive government." He would go on to say that the Taliban was, quote, "part of the reality of the country, but that it was not all one nation, which has a diverse sectarian and ethnic constituency." While it is that the Taliban rules the country, the Taliban is largely Sunni and ethnic Pashtun, while 10 to 15% of the population is in fact Shia, and more than half of the 40 million Afghans are not actually Pashtun. This, as you can perhaps imagine, creates a lot of identitarian conflicts within the country. The Taliban's Ministry of National Defense would call for new diplomacy to resolve a dispute over natural resources that would date back centuries, saying, quote, "Making excuses for war and negative actions is not in the interest of any of the parties. We do not want relations with our neighboring countries to deteriorate." But that's just it. For decades, access to water resources have been a point of contention between Iran and Afghanistan. This is something that is not new. The Helmand River, which flows from the mountains of the Hindu Kush through Afghanistan into southeastern Iran, this is a basic source of water for both countries. It is something that has been critical to agriculture, fishing, and human consumption for millions of people on both sides of the border for thousands of years. The modern dispute, though, largely dates back to the 1940s and 1950s, this being when Afghanistan would build 2 dams on the Helmand River, the Kajiki and the Grishk, things that would curtail the water flow into Iran. This would prove to be a bit of an issue, but in 1973, the 2 countries would end up signing a treaty on sharing water resources. This is something that would focus heavily on the distribution of water, but the accord here was neither ratified nor ever actually implemented. Like, this was something that was agreed upon, but never actually fully agreed upon. It gets really complicated. And this is the way things would kind of work for 50 years until in February of 2021, Iran and Afghanistan, which at the time was still under its old government, would sign an agreement based on the 1973 treaty, and even that would still not resolve the disputes with dams. That is something that would continue for the next several years. The Taliban takeover of the government would then subsequently complicate that issue further. For both nations, this is a critical issue. Both nations have faced periodic droughts, which in turn spark further tensions. Since 1945, sequential Afghan governments, including the monarchy, which lasted until 1979, the Soviet-backed government in the 1980s, the Taliban in the 90s, and the US-backed democratic government from 2004 to 2021, and the Taliban again after 2021, all of these different groups have built, repaired, or upgraded dams on the Helmand, including the Kabul Dam that curtailed the flow of water to Iran. This is something that can easily be used as a weapon and has been done in the past. The Taliban closed the sluices of the Kajiki Dam to cut off water to Iran during a drought from 1998 to 2001, this being something that would severely affect the common border area. When the dam was completed in March of 2021, Afghan President Ashraf Ghani would say that Afghanistan would stop allowing extra water to flow to Iran for free and would instead trade water for oil. Meaning we're talking about something that at this point cannot even just be used as a weapon, but specifically as a tool to extract oil tributes. It's a threat. Iranian officials would subsequently blame the Helmand River declining water flow on Afghanistan's dam projects, although droughts have also played a key role and have made things significantly worse. Since the early 2000s, parts of the Helmand River in Iran have been dry for up to 10 months out of the year. I mean, imagine that. You have a river in which 10 months out of the year, there is no water. As Iranian President Hassan Rouhani would say in 2017, quote, "We cannot remain indifferent to what is damaging our environment." The construction of several dams in Afghanistan, the Kajiki, Kabul Khan, and Selma dams, and other dams in the north and south of Afghanistan impacts our Khorasan and Sistan and Baluchistan provinces. These dams have only further imperiled the Helmand wetlands, which span Iran and Afghanistan. About 2/3 of the wetlands, which include around 3 lakes, are within Iran, and for thousands of years have provided local communities with water. In the year 2000, the Helmand wetlands, which cover over 2,000 square miles, were the world's 7th largest wetland. But by the year 2024, they had largely dried up due to drought and inefficient use of water. The wetlands still constitute Iran's 3rd largest lake, but it is a far cry of what it once was. Dry conditions have only led to extremely dry soil, which have contributed to a cycle of dust storms. Occasional rainfall or floods would temporarily revitalize parts of the wetland, but it simply has not been enough to reverse decades of damage. Dry soil also leaves Sistan and Baluchistan vulnerable to flash floods. In January of 2020, 3 days of heavy rain, the equivalent of what was a year's worth of rainfall for the region, would subsequently displace thousands of people, killing at least 3 and destroying crops, homes, and infrastructure. The floods would manage to do around $53 million in damages, with limited government relief to compensate coming in far too late and simply not enough. The people of the region are suffering, but the issue is that restoring the wetlands would require several billion cubic meters of water to be redirected to the wetlands region. In April of 2020, the European Union and the UN Development Program would pledge $11.7 million to help rehabilitate the vulnerable ecosystem, but ultimately nothing has really worked so far. It brings up the question then, does that mean that a full-scale war will break out between Iran and Afghanistan over water rights? Well, unlikely. At least at this point in time that we are making this. Though the positions are certainly unpleasant, the crisis that we are talking about has not developed to the point that conflict is preferred over dialogue and a peaceful resolution. There have been some border issues, but the likelihood of that breaking out into a full-scale war is unlikely as it currently stands. In comparison to the other powers that we would be talking about, there are at least greater precedents towards dealing with Iran and the treaty that had been established in 1973 versus the others. The issue, though, the question becomes, what would happen if the environmental factors such as droughts grew worse? The longer that this goes on, the more potential there is for conflict to break out. Even further droughts would force the Taliban to retain more water and potentially set the two countries on a collision course for conflict. And even if it is not just a singular issue for why two countries would then be prepared to fight, there are other factors. Water, drug trafficking, ideological reasons, there are any number of issues as to why a conflict could very well break out in the future between Afghanistan and Iran. Really, at this point, only time will tell, and it will largely depend upon weather and geopolitical issues. But that, my friends, is the issue with Iran, something that is significantly more toned down. The dispute with its northern neighbors, that is significantly more likely to be a more brutal affair long down the road. Because it really looks at this point like Afghanistan's canal projects that they are working on are going to deepen Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan's water crises. Hey everyone, it's Takuya here, and before we get back to the show, I would just like to thank today's sponsor, Rocket Money. I know that I have talked about it on more than one occasion, and the reality of it is that I will gladly keep on taking the ads from this service because it is something that I have used for literally years and has saved my life on more than one occasion. Have you, by any chance, ever subscribed to something and then subsequently forgotten about it? Because I do that a lot. I subscribe to a lot of different things when trying to find sources for all the things when I make my different episodes for YouTube and for here, and then I ended up, well, paying way more than I ever actually needed to, and it comes back to haunt me. Over 74% of people have subscriptions that they've forgotten about. Like, again, I definitely have as well. And most Americans think that they're spending like $62 a month on subscriptions, but the reality is way closer to $300. That is literally thousands of dollars a year, that most of which we have probably completely forgotten about. Rocket Money is a personal finance app that helps you find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It will monitor your spending, and it will help lower your bills all in one place. It is something that is incredibly valuable, and so I'm telling you this right now. Stop wasting money on things that you don't use. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions by going to rocketmoney.com/ho. That is rocketmoney.com/HOE. Shifting north, Uzbekistan is currently facing a severe water shortage for agricultural needs. According to regional experts, the deficit could reach 7 billion cubic meters by 2030 and double by 2050. At the same time this is happening, Ashgabat within Turkmenistan is desperately searching for lasting solutions to its own water issues. Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan represent 2 of the 17 countries that are facing extremely high levels of baseline water stress. Both countries border Afghanistan, where the construction of an irrigation canal is bound to deepen the water issues of both Central Asian republics. The water situation had never really been good for them in the first place, but things are set to get significantly worse. In September of 2023, Uzbekistan's president, Shavkat Mirziyoyev, would raise concerns about the Kosh-Tepe Canal in Afghanistan at the, well, this is going to be a long name for it here, but prepare, the Council of Heads of the Founder States of the International Fund for Saving the RLC. For anyone unfamiliar with the issues that the RLC has had over the past, 60, 70 years, we'll explain that here in a second because it's all tied together. Either way, the president of Uzbekistan would assert that the canal's introduction could, quote, radically change the water regime and balance in Central Asia. Why is that the case, you may wonder? Well, as we've previously established, if you recall from the beginning of this video, when we talked about agriculture within Afghanistan and how much people have been suffering from a mixture of droughts and loss of farmland, the Taliban has termed the canal project as a lifeline for its drought-ridden areas. The canal is being constructed on the Amu Darya River in the country's northern Balkh province. The project aims to turn some 550,000 hectares of desert land into arable farmland in Afghanistan's arid northern provinces. With how desperate the food situation has become within the state, they need this kind of project in order to become self-sufficient and actually be able to feed their own population. The problem is that water distribution among these Central Asian republics from the Amu Darya Basin is based on the, quote, Agreement on Cooperation in Joint Management, Use, and Protection of Interstate Sources of Water Resources that had been signed by ministers of water resources of Central Asian states back in 1992. Afghanistan is not part of this. Before all of this went down, Soviet officials had signed an agreement in Moscow known as Protocol 566, something that would guide the allocation of water resources in Central Asia. The protocol would also create the river basin organizations to help manage quotas. This was all well and good for a while, but the problem is that as the Soviet Union in the 90s began to collapse, the 5 Central Asian republics signed a new agreement on, quote, cooperation in joint management, use, and protection of interstate sources of water resources. This accord would create the Interstate Commission for Water Coordination of Central Asia, or ICWC, which, as I've explained here before with a lot of these things for managing water resources, does not actually include Afghanistan to oversee the distribution of said water resources. Afghanistan has been a bit of a diplomatic pariah, and their construction of the Catastrophic canal now looks to disrupt that system right to its very source. Now, my friends, in order to be perfectly fair when I'm talking about this, it is not a problem that was specifically created by the Taliban in the first place. This problem of dependency upon water resources is something that has existed for a long time and was created by the Soviet Union years prior. They are the ones to blame as to why the issues have become as bad as they have. Under Soviet governance, after the period of 1922, the process of expanding the land in Central Asia for growing cotton would accelerate exponentially. Cotton was king, not only in the southern United States in the 1800s, but specifically within the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. Massive water diversion projects were completed that would bring more land into cultivation, but in doing so, that would also siphon off additional millions of gallons of water from the rivers that would feed into things like the Aral Sea. For anyone who remembers seeing those pictures of the Aral Sea over the years in their history textbooks and wondering why did it shrink so badly, well, this is the answer. The Karakum Canal, which was initiated in 1954 and ultimately would reach over 850 miles in length at its height, would draw an annual average of 3 cubic miles of water from the Amu Darya. The focus on cotton, which is a profitable export crop, would result in a decline of Central Asia's agricultural diversity, which at one point in time was a region that was famous for numerous different orchards, vineyards, and fields of grain. But to the Soviets, that didn't really matter. Under their planning, cotton became the belozoloto, or the white gold. But that gold was obtained at a very high cost to the environment, and agriculture in Central Asia would increasingly become a cotton monoculture that was devoted to delivering ever greater quotas of the fiber to state factories and overseas buyers. This is what would kill the water systems. The death spiral of the Aral Sea would begin in 1961. The cumulative effects of the drive to bring more and more land into cotton cultivation became very obvious that year when you look at the discharge stations that the Soviet government had installed on the Amu Darya and the Sir Darya River, near where each would empty into the Aral Sea. These were the points that would be able to monitor the water flow and see what was going on. The station at the Amu Darya, located at Timur Bay of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, it recorded an annual discharge into the sea of 29.2 cubic kilometers, or 7 cubic miles. But to the north, the station on the Sir Darya at Kazalinsk in the Kazakh SSR, it recorded 0 discharge. Yes, you heard me right. It had 0 water flow for the year of 1961. The river feeding the ocean was emptied in order to use for irrigation. Just that previous year, in 1960, the Sir Darya had discharged around 21 cubic kilometers, or 5 cubic miles, into the Aral Sea, and the Amu Darya had contributed 37.8, for a total of 58.8 cubic kilometers, or 14 cubic miles, for the year 1960. But in a single year, the discharge into the Aral had plummeted by over 50%. The total amount of discharge would not exceed the 1960 figure for the following 3 decades. Incredibly, the total volume of discharge from the rivers would barely reach 8 cubic kilometers, or 2 cubic miles, in 1974. And by the year 1989, it had completely collapsed to only 4.3 cubic kilometers, or 1 cubic mile. That is less than 1/10, 10% of the amount of water that had flowed into the Aral Sea only 30 years before. 90% of the water was gone. The Aral Sea, the world's 4th largest lake in 1960, had been sucked dry by the Soviet obsession to produce white gold at any cost. What is incredible about this entire thing, or terrible you could argue, is that although the losses to the Aral Sea were obvious by the mid-1960s, Soviet planners would continue to increase the acreage that was devoted to cotton production well into the 1980s. Every single year, the amount of land that was being used for cotton production was going up. It was obvious that the entire thing was unsustainable, but to Soviet central planners, that didn't matter. They needed to produce more cotton. In fact, the majority of these increases were not achieved by switching land to cotton from another crop, but rather by bringing additional land into production. So it does not mean that the majority of production was coming from people switching from producing wheat to producing cotton. They were still producing wheat, but now in addition to that, more land was being produced that would make cotton. This means even in comparison to just switching crops, yet more water had to be extracted from feeder systems, which would compound and accelerate the Aral's retreat. As an example, to understand what I'm talking about and what creates the setting for this, between the period of 1960 and 1985, the amount of irrigated land in Uzbek SSR, the Soviet Union's biggest cotton grower, would rise by 33%. In the neighboring Turkmen SSR, the percentage of irrigated land would increase by an astonishing 123%, with virtually all of the new watered farmland being devoted specifically to cotton production. In terms of just raw output, the strategy did work for Soviet managers. Gross yields of raw cotton fiber in the Uzbek SSR would rise from 2.95 million metric tons in 1960 to 5.16 million metric tons in 1985, an increase of 75%. In the Turkmen SSR, yields would skyrocket an amazing 217% in the same 25-year span. That is massive. The reason that I mention this is because that is what creates the context, that is what creates the setting behind why Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and other Central Asian republics are so incredibly dependent upon water. Though the entirety of the Soviet Union and its Soviet states would suffer from economic collapse with the political fall of the Soviet Union in the 90s, the Central Asian republics were still largely dependent upon their white gold for their economy. And now, the Taliban threaten not only their economies, but their very lives. That is why this canal is so incredibly dangerous. The 285-kilometer long, 100-meter deep canal being built is expected to cost around $684 million, and is scheduled at this point to be completed by 2028. The Taliban is funding the project from its own resources, largely generating funds by selling mining rights in Afghanistan, primarily to Chinese companies. Yes, my friends, as it stands, over 200 companies are engaged in the construction of the canal. And as it turns out here in 2024, China is the only nation on earth to actually recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government, with their companies in Afghanistan and their mining of resources obviously having nothing to do with that decision, because of course. Either way, the big problem that is faced with this is that the Amu Darya's waters make up about 80% of all accessible water resources in the region. Thus, the Goshtepe Canal will seriously affect the Central Asian republics, especially Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. According to some experts, the two countries may lose up to 15% of the irrigation water that they draw upon from the river. Once the canal is completed, almost a third of the Amu Darya's waters will flow into the interior of Afghanistan. Several regions of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan will consequently witness a sharp decline in the volume of accessible water. That canal, however, is just one factor. Kabul also plans on building the Dasht-i-Jun hydroelectric complex to gain greater control over the flow of the Pand River. As one environmental expert would point out, taken together, these two large projects will lead to a sharp decrease in the release of water resources to the territories of Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan. That is already bad, but what is arguably worse about this entire situation is that the efforts are likely to be extremely wasteful. Remember what I said at the beginning of this video, why I spent so much time talking about the context and setting of this. When the Taliban took over the entirety of the government within Kabul, when they took over Afghanistan, it led to a massive brain drain. As one environmental expert would say, building the canal is easy. Establishing an irrigation system is 10 times more difficult. The Taliban have never exactly been known for their engineers, and trained experts are most certainly hard to come by. Without the right brain power and technical know-how, it's estimated at this point that 30 to 40% of water that is diverted could just end up being wasted, either leaching back into the ground or being contaminated beyond the point that it can actually be used. The Taliban simply does not have the technical know-how to do something of this kind of scale. My friends, when we talk about this, the Taliban's diversion of the Amu Darya River, when it flows to Turkmenistan, when it flows to Uzbekistan, this is something that is not just a problem, this is a potential catastrophe in the making per hydrology experts. In the case of Turkmenistan, Turkmenistan relies on the Amu Darya River for around 90% of its water supply. A reduction of that by 10 to 15% when times are already tough would be a catastrophe. And then when you look at Uzbekistan, the impact that the canal would have on agriculture would also be terrible. The country of Uzbekistan relies heavily on agriculture, with nearly 40% of the population either directly or indirectly being associated with the sector. With 4.5 million hectares of arable land, Uzbekistan primarily cultivates cotton, wheat, barley, rice, corn, potatoes, fruits, and vegetables. The decline in water resources will likely lead to a serious blow to the cotton industry, as cotton, at this point, from what I've already established, accounts for around 17% of Uzbekistan's entire GDP. Even a minor loss in water would still be catastrophic to the industry. This is bad because, as I've already said, many of the Central Asian republics are already dealing with a number of water shortages, being caused specifically by drought, desertification, and more. Climate change and general drought are major causes of Uzbekistan's depleting water resources. As one scientist within Uzbekistan would warn, we are losing 15% of the water due to climate change, and if we lose another 10%, 1/4 of our water will be lost. This will cause many crises. It will be difficult for us to fill our reservoirs. We will have to build additional facilities. The entire system might just break down. As you can imagine, with how serious this is, the nations of the Central Asian republics are not just letting things sit and let be. From May 27th to the 29th of 2024, only a few months ago at the time that I'm making this video, there was an international conference on climate change that was held in Almaty, Kazakhstan. It would draw official representatives from Central Asian countries, journalists, and international experts. The issue with Afghanistan, the Taliban, and water resources, this would become a central issue. As one official would say, quote, "The government of Uzbekistan is trying to establish relations with Afghanistan, but the Taliban is very tough. Afghanistan does not intend to make any agreements with Central Asia on this matter." Because that's just it. The Taliban, despite assuring Uzbekistan this last year in October that the canal project would not cause it any harm, has not been willing to work with any of the nations around it to mitigate any of the potential problems that the water issues will cause. What is so bad about this is that even without the canal being constructed, Central Asia was already projected to face a water deficit of 5 to 12 cubic kilometers annually by 2028 or 2029. This being something that would threaten food, drinking water, and energy supplies. But with the construction of the canal, with the construction of these projects, it is going to be significantly worse. The result of such a breakdown would be catastrophic for the nations of Central Asia. It is something that morally and physically these nations cannot allow to happen. It can spell the end of economies, regimes, and the deaths of potentially millions as people suffer. But whether it will lead fully to an armed conflict, that is up to debate. We are talking about a situation in which you could very well see the first real water war in history of modern nations fighting over water resources. Are we at that point yet? No. But at the time that I'm making this in 2024, with the project set to complete by 2028, if something does not happen within the span of the next couple years, who can really say? My friends, this has been Stakui with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. Thank you all very much for watching. I appreciate you joining me after all this time. I know that it's taken me a while to create this video in the first place, and I apologize. There have been many different projects, and even now I have 2 more videos that I have to create after this because of just how many things have been happening in the recent couple weeks. I'm sure that I'm going to put out an announcement about it already, but one of the things that I'm going to be doing is I have to cover now the issue that has just happened with Venezuela. So that is the next one that I'm working on. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support means the world to me. I appreciate all of you. I will see you next time, and goodbye, my friends.